What's up, everyone? I have finally finished reading through every single one of Lovecraft stories. I bought this book a couple years ago, and since then I've been gradually reading through this, just a couple stories here and there, reading through all of his work, and I am finally done. In this month of May, I've read his final two stories, The Shadow Out of Time and The Haunter of the Dark, and it's sort of bittersweet having finally finished all of his work. I'm glad that I finally read through all of it. I've grown to love his work more and more as I've read it. And I'm also kind of sad that he didn't live to write more, because his style of writing is just so unique, so distinct. And he just had a way of storytelling, a way with horror stories that no other author has ever had. And it's just very unique. And yeah, I just love his style of stories, honestly. And today I'm going to be talking about my top 10 favorite Lovecraft stories. Now, it was very difficult to put this list together. And I mean, extremely difficult to narrow it down to top 10. Of course, this is just my personal list, my personal favorites. These are not necessarily his best or most popular stories. This is just what I came up with. And even right up until I started recording this, I was still kind of making changes to this list. So it might continue to change a little bit in the future. I don't know. It's really hard to decide and just pick a top 10. I thought about doing like a top 20 or something, but then I figured at that point I might as well just do a ranking of all of his stories. And I don't really want to do that. That's too much work. Way too much work to go through and decide which ones I like more and place them all on the list. And yeah, that requires too much thinking for me. So I just settled on a top 10, and we're just going to go with this for right now. So I do want to give a couple of honorable mentions, though. There were a couple stories that really pained me to leave off of this list. So I want to just give a few quick honorable mentions. And those are The Picture in the House, which is one of his earlier short stories. And it's only a few pages long. But it was one of the very first Lovecraft stories I ever read back when I was in my teens. And I remember that story just creeping me the hell out. I really love The Picture in the House. And another honorable mention I want to give is to, let me look at my notes here. I got my list right here on a notebook. Okay, never mind. I guess I didn't write down what my honorable mentions were besides that one. I thought I did. Okay, we're just going to keep going. So let's just jump right into it, guys. Again, this is just my personal opinion, my top 10 list. And at number 10, we have The Temple. Now, The Temple is also, I believe, one of his earlier stories. And it's not a Cthulhu mythos stories. It's actually about these German soldiers that are on a submarine. And they encounter this mysterious underwater city, sort of like an Atlantis type of thing, while they're on their submarine. And there's something very strange, very alluring about it. And some of the soldiers on the submarine start disappearing slowly, like one by one. And they believe it has something to do with this strange city, underwater city, but they don't know what it is exactly. And I wanted to put this on my list because this is one that really, really grabbed me and just wouldn't let go. And from what I've seen online and watched reviews of Lovecraft and seen other people's favorites list, this is one I feel like doesn't get talked about at all. I think this is a really underrated Lovecraft story. And I also think that it's a little bit different than usual. It's not a Cthulhu mythos story. And I just feel like it's one of his more unique works. And yeah, I really like The Temple. So I just decided to put it on this list at number 10. So, and I'll put down below somewhere here, I'll put down each of these stories and like what date they were released and stuff. So moving on to number 9, we have The Haunter of the Dark. Now, The Haunter of the Dark was, I believe, the very final story that Lovecraft wrote. And apparently, I found this out afterward, that it's actually a sequel to a story that was written by Robert Bloch. Together, he and Robert Bloch wrote a few Cthulhu mythos stories and sort of like dedicated them to one another. And this story is one of Lovecraft's more like ambiguous, uneventful type of stories. It's told through a series of notes and diary entries of this guy who was found dead in his apartment building. And from there, we learn a bunch of very disturbing things in relation to like the old ones and the elder gods and all that sort of like Cthulhu mythos stuff. But what I really like most about this story is the setting and the location of it. So, as per typical of a Lovecraft story, there's always like this one creepy building or location that's described in very vivid detail. And the location in question in The Haunter of the Dark is an old abandoned church. And it is one of the most memorable and creepiest settings of any Lovecraft story, in my opinion. And it is just described in just such vivid detail. And it's just unsettling reading about our main character just wandering and exploring this old church that all the locals are afraid of and have all these superstitions of. And yeah, Haunter of the Dark is a really good one. Not his very best, or maybe not one of his most popular, but I really like this one. So yeah, Haunter of the Dark comes in at number 9. And it was a great story too for Lovecraft to go out on, like his final story. So yeah. At number 8, we have the Dunwich Horror. Now, the Dunwich Horror is a really good one. It's far from perfect. There's a few issues I have with it, especially the climax of the story. It starts to get a little silly, and the ending isn't the most satisfying ending in the world. But this one is really entertaining. This one is pretty dark, and it also has a surprising amount of action in it, which is pretty rare for Lovecraft stories. Not many of his stories have much action in them. And in this one, this sort of elder god or some sort of cosmic being, one of these Cthulhu mythos monsters, I forget which one he is summoned through this evil ritual and starts to wreak havoc on this small village. And things get pretty crazy. And so yeah, the Dunwich Horror is a really good story. I really enjoyed this one. So yeah, the Dunwich Horror comes in at number 8. At number 7, we have At the Mountains of Madness. Now, this is one of his longer stories. I believe this is his second longest story behind The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and is actually considered a short novel, a novella. And At the Mountains of Madness is probably his most atmospheric story, in my opinion, or at least one of. And it takes place in the Antarctic, I think, out in the isolated, freezing cold weather in the mountains with icebergs and just ocean all around and just these dark, looming mountains. And Lovecraft has a way of describing things that is just so immersive, and it just makes you feel like you're right there. And there's just a lot of really creepy stuff in the story. And with this being a longer one, it does drag a little bit at times. There's a lot of repetitive description in the story for sure, and it's certainly not for everybody, but it is very effective. It does make you feel like you're right there in that cold, isolated atmosphere. And you also learn a lot about the Cthulhu mythos in this one. Unfortunately, this one is also not perfect for me. It also lacks a little bit in the denouement. The whole like final act of the story is not the most satisfying in the world, at least in my opinion. I think it could have had a little bit more of a satisfying ending, but still, At the Mountains of Madness is undoubtedly one of his best stories, I think. And yeah, that's why it comes in at number 7 for me. So at number 6, we have The Whisperer in the Darkness. And The Whisperer in Darkness is one that's a little bit predictable, I think. When I started reading this one, I kind of knew where things were going, but it didn't make me enjoy it any less. I really like The Whisperer in Darkness. It's basically about these two guys that are exchanging letters on a series of strange occurrences in a small town. And it's these sort of strange occurrences and things in question that they're discussing have sort of been brought to the attention of the general public and other like scholars and like other higher up people, but they're all sort of like scoffed at and disregarded. And these things in question have to do with alien nature. This is very much a sci-fi type of story. This one doesn't lean into horror as much as some of his others do. But yeah, his friend ends up deciding to visit him towards the end, and I won't really talk about it too much. I'm kind of remaining ambiguous. It's kind of hard to talk about it without spoiling it. It's just something you have to read for yourself to see what I mean. But yeah, this is a really good one. I really like The Whisperer in Darkness. Again, I kind of saw where things were going once we got close to the end, but I still really enjoyed it. I really liked it. This was a very creepy, very tense story. So yeah, The Whisperer in Darkness comes in at number 6. At number 5, we have one of Lovecraft's most well-known stories, and this one has also been adapted into a film that came out somewhat recently, and that is The Color Out of Space. Now, this one is not one of the Cthulhu Mythos stories. This is one of his just more standalone, like sci-fi horror tales, more sci-fi. And it's really, really effective. And yeah, it's basically about this color, like this meteor that comes from outer space, crashes into this farmland, this farmhouse where this family lives, and a lot of bad things start happening, and there's really not any explanation for it. There's just a lot of ambiguity and mystery revolving around this meteor that crashed, and these strange colors, and the plant life and the forest, and everything slowly starts to decay. The people in the farmhouse start to act very strangely, and it's just a very weird, very bizarre story, but it works very well. That's the whole point of it, is it's just supposed to make you like wonder what the hell is going on. And yeah, The Color Out of Space, what more can I say about this one? This one is a classic. I think it's one of his most popular stories for a good reason. So yeah, that comes in at number 5. At number 4, we have probably Lovecraft's most well-known and popular story, and that is The Call of Cthulhu. I believe this was the very first story I read by Lovecraft. When I first sought him out in my teen years, I was aware of The Call of Cthulhu, and I wanted to read it for myself because I'd always heard about it. And at the time, I don't remember thinking all that much about it. I wasn't amazed by it. I didn't fall in love with Lovecraft initially. I had to read more of his stories, and then over time, I sort of fell in love with his work. But going back and rereading it, I can say that this is definitely one of Lovecraft's best stories. The Call of Cthulhu is revered, highly revered, and very popular for good reason. And it's a little bit unconventional. It's sort of like a story within a story, and it's told kind of in the past tense. Again, sort of similar to some of his other works where it's told through like a series of documents and letters of someone who's dead and long gone. But it's very effective. And some of the things that we learn in some of like these letters and documents and such are very, very disturbing. This story is one of Lovecraft's darker stories, and it's just really good. I don't know what else I can say about The Call of Cthulhu. So yeah, if you've never read The Call of Cthulhu, it's definitely one you need to read, I think, if you're into classic horror, in my opinion. So yeah, that comes in at number 4 for me. At number 3, we have The Rats in the Walls. Now, The Rats in the Walls is, I don't know if it's really considered one of his more popular ones or not. I'm not entirely sure on that. I know I've seen it on some people's lists. I know Michael K. Vaughan put it on his list, although I think it was higher up. Like, I don't know, like the 7th or 8th story on his top 10 list, something like that. But this is, in my opinion, one of Lovecraft's creepiest stories. And again, this one's not a Cthulhu Mythos story. This one is straight horror, which I think is why I like it so much, because I tend to find myself drawn more towards the straight horror stories rather than the sci-fi ones. Science fiction has never been my favorite genre. I do like sci-fi, but it's never been my favorite genre by any means. So I think that's why I've always been drawn to this Rats in the Wall story. And where some of his other stories falter a little bit in the climax and fail to deliver with like a big payoff, The Rats in the Wall succeeds very well in doing this, in my opinion. The tension like slowly builds in this story, and then towards the end, the payoff is just terrifying, super creepy, and it feels in line with the rest of the story. Lovecraft doesn't cheat you out with a bunch of misinformation. He doesn't skip over anything. Yeah, I really like The Rats in the Walls. This is a very, very good, very creepy story in my opinion, and it comes in at number 3 on my list. At number 2, we have The Thing on the Doorstep. Now, The Thing on the Doorstep is definitely one of my favorites, and I think it's one of his most popular as well. And I feel like this story could be considered the epitome of his work. It features so many of the elements and like techniques he uses in his stories in this one, and it's done all very effectively. It's a very tight story. That's what I like about it. There's not many wasted words in it. It doesn't have a lot of repetitive description, and like some of his other stories are a little bit flawed, like I talked about at the Mountains of Madness or the Dunwich Horror. Some of them just have little flaws here and there that kind of keep them from being like, perfect 5 out of 5 stars. And uh, The Thing on the Doorstep is just a very tight, very well written story. One of his best works, I think, hands down. And yeah, you know what? I'm actually going to read the very first sentence of the story because I feel like it's just the most explosive opening of any of his stories. And after you read this first paragraph, if it doesn't want to make you read the rest of the story, then I don't know why you'd want to read any Lovecraft at all. Like, this is just such a good story. It's just such a tight, fast-paced, just excellent tale that also has a little bit of heart to it as well, which is kind of surprising for Lovecraft. It's not often you find like likable characters in his stories. In this one, you kind of have that a little bit at least, and that's not something you see very often in his story. So yeah, I'm just going to read the first paragraph here of The Thing on the Doorstep, and you'll see what I'm talking about here. It is true that I have sent 6 bullets through the head of my best friend, and yet I hope to show by this statement that I am not his murderer. At first I shall be called a madman, madder than the man I shot in his cell at the Arkham Sanitarium. Later some of my readers will weigh each statement, correlate it with the known facts, and ask themselves how I could have believed otherwise than as I did after facing the evidence of that horror, that thing on the doorstep. So yeah, that's the very first paragraph of that story. This story just grabs you and it does not let go. So yeah, The Thing on the Doorstep, I absolutely love it. I don't want to talk too much about it and give anything away. It's just one that I highly recommend, one that you need to read for yourself. So yeah, it comes in at number 2 for me. And at number 1, and even though, I'm just going to say real quick, even though I put this at number 1, I don't know if this is necessarily my favorite Lovecraft story of all time. Again, it's very difficult to narrow it down to a top 10. And a lot of these stories on here are kind of closely tied. And on a different day in the future, I don't know, I might rearrange this list. I might change it a little bit. But for right now, I'm just going with this as my number 1. And that is The Shadow over Innsmouth. Now, Lovecraft is notorious for telling his stories in sort of the past tense and revealing events through like diary entries and letters and that sort of thing, sort of telling the story as it has already happened in discovery of other characters, like I said, notes and that kind of thing. That's just sort of typical of a Lovecraft story. The Call of Cthulhu does it. The Haunter of the Dark does it. And The Shadow over Innsmouth, that is not the case. The Shadow over Innsmouth is written in like present time where things are occurring and we experience them along with our main character. And it's very, very effective. And it makes me wonder why Lovecraft didn't do this more often, because it plays out very, very well. This story is incredibly suspenseful. And when I was going into this story, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And in The Shadow over Innsmouth, our main character visits the town known as Innsmouth, and it's a very like isolated town where all of its inhabitants are very strange, very secluded people that are kind of shut off from the outside world, and there's a lot of superstition and prejudice against them. And he goes to this town to try to figure out what's going on and where all these secrets and rumors are stemming from. And what he discovers in this town is absolutely horrifying. He learns that there is truth behind a lot of these superstitions and such. And I don't want to spoil anything, but bad things go down in the town of Innsmouth. And again, it was a surprise to me when I was reading this because I was not expecting it. But there is some action in this story. It's very suspenseful, very tense, and it works very well. I don't know why Lovecraft didn't write stories like this more often instead of just constantly telling them in the past tense or through the discovery of like journals and documents and that kind of thing, because it was very effective. The Shadow over Innsmouth was an incredible story. I highly recommend it. I don't know if I would recommend it as the first Lovecraft story you read. I don't think I would recommend it as a starting point because I wouldn't want to set your expectations up super high with this one and then go and read some of his other stories and not be as into those ones because of how good Shadow over Innsmouth is. So yeah, I actually don't know if I would recommend starting with Shadow over Innsmouth, but it is definitely one of his very best stories. And as of right now, I have it as my number one favorite. So yeah, Shadow over Innsmouth comes in at number one. It is an excellent story, very suspenseful, great twist ending too. Very excellent twist ending. And yeah, I don't really know what else I have to say about it. So that's my top 10 list, guys, of my favorite Lovecraft stories. Let me know if you've read any of his stories down in the comments below. If not, let me know if you plan to or what your thoughts are on Lovecraft. And that's pretty much all I have for today. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, have a great day.